Okay, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. For those that don't know me, I'm Brent Hoagman, co-founder and chairman of Founders Forum, Founders Factory, First Minute Capital, a few others. We are a global community of the top tech founders, corporate CEOs, and senior investors. We normally run events in many European and global capitals, primarily in London and New York, are the flagship events. But right now, this is FF Live, and we are thrilled to bring this to you and to bring the community together where we can't have physical events. But trust me, we love physical events, and we are planning, by the way, to do a hybrid event in September. So we are sending out reminders this week to check who feels that they want to come in person and in September and who wants to just join remotely. But we expect to be streaming that event globally as well, into physical locations across the world for those who can't travel. So this session is being streamed to our Founders Forum LinkedIn page. So welcome to everyone joining us there. A recording of the session will also be posted along with other FF Live sessions on the Founders Forum YouTube page once this is over. So please head over there and subscribe. I'm going to be pleased to hand you over to our moderator, Shahrzad Rafati, who is founder and CEO of Broadband TV, BBTV. So it is a media tech company that enables content owners to be more successful. BBTV has become one of the pioneers defining and advancing the media tech space, empowering a new generation of storytellers and transforming entertainment and the way that content is being produced and consumed. Shahrzad has built a quadruple bottom line business that measures success not only in financial performance, but also in employee culture, social community, and environmental KPIs. BBTV has amazingly a 0% pay gap between male and female employees. 43% of its employees are female, and 46 of its managers are female managers. Social change. Shahrzad actively pursues ways to encourage social change and is a champion for equality in all forms. She's passionate about job creation, climate action, education, and advancing opportunities for women and girls, and is regularly cited as one of Canada's, if not the top entrepreneur. So we are delighted to have Shahrzad and two of the world's best media CEOs. So Shahrzad, over to you.
Thank you so much, Brent. Hi, everyone. I'm very pleased to obviously be here with all of you today. Also, a big thank you to Brent and the Founders Forum team for facilitating this event. Always, obviously, great to see you. We'll cover a number of topics in the world of news and journalism. And today's conversation includes, of course, two of the great leaders, as Brent mentioned, whose decisions have a massive impact on the media industry and our world. Mark and Mathias, great to have you here with us. And I'd like to start with a quick bio on each of you. Mark Thompson is the president and CEO of the New York Times. Mark became the president and CEO of the New York Times company in November of 2012 and has directed the company's strategy and led its expansion of digital and global operations. Before joining the Times Company, Mark served as the Director General of the BBC, where he shaped the organization to meet the challenge of the digital age. He also oversaw transformation of the BBC itself, driving productivity and efficiency through the introduction of new technologies and bold organizational redesign. Dr. Mathias Döpfner is the CEO of Axel Springer, and he has been the CEO of Axel Springer since January of 2012. Mathias became the member of the executive board responsible for multimedia division in July of 2000 and took charge of the newspapers division in October of 2000. And following positions at Gruner & Jahr and other German newspapers, Mathias is also one of Axel Springer's largest shareholders, and he transformed actually the company into a digital business. He's also the president of the Federal German Newspaper Association and a member of the Netflix board of directors. So now, before we look into the future of the media industry, I think we need to take a moment to look at where we find ourselves today. The media industry has seen significant evolution. It has been responding to discussions around fake news from the Trump administration for years. And then in March this year, we've had the largest global pandemic in over 100 years. The world has been in lockdown. And of course, whole industries have slowed, pivoted, or ceased to exist. And this was really closely followed by one of the most important human rights movements that we've seen in a generation, Black Lives Matter. But all of this has happened. There's been a realization to the importance of leadership. We've seen vividly contrasting leadership styles by different world leaders who have demonstrated dramatically different results in terms of how they've managed through the pandemic, comforting the public through obviously loss and upheaval. We've become painfully aware of an absence of leadership when it has occurred, and we've seen strong and unlikely leadership emerge. And it seems that the public at large now has a real thirst for leadership. And given this, I would like to obviously ask our two amazing panelists, please tell me and tell our audience your views on the importance of leadership right now, by extension, and how it has impacted your personal approach with your organization. And it'd be great if we can start with Mark.
Thanks, Shahrzad, and I've been unmuted so I can speak. So the paradox of leadership, and I think it's true always, but it's particularly true during this crisis, and both the COVID crisis and also the immense challenge of the Black Lives Matter moment and the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, is leaders need to listen and they need to respond to their communities. And leaders need to lead. And how do you strike the right balance between listening and leading, I think is the big question. I've literally just come 20 minutes from a webinar for people who work at the New York Times. We had 3,800 participants out of 4,500 people, which means in practice that pretty much everyone who wasn't literally working on an essential task was part of the conversation. And a lot of the conversation was straightforwardly senior leaders being available for questions and indeed criticism from colleagues. Questions about diversity inside the organization, questions about why haven't we already got a completely worked out plan for the future of work at the Times, the return to office question mark moment, and to hold us to account. And one of the things I said to my colleagues is to thank them for their engagement, to thank them for the incredibly lively discourse that's happening currently, for example, at the New York Times on Slack and other similar social media channels, and making the point that that conversation actually brings up ideas, brings up issues, and helps us do our jobs as leaders better. But there are moments when you have to lead, and one of them was to say there are limits to the kind of appropriateness of language and the strength of feeling, and in particular, the need to avoid personal attacks on other individuals, not senior leaders, but other named individuals in the organization. So trying to set some kind of parameters around the conversation. And I think the other thing about leadership is trying to provide a truthful narrative for what's happening, so that you're kind of guiding people through the weeks and months, because this is a time of such uncertainty with what's going well, what's going badly. At the Times, economics are pretty good, actually. Our digital subscription business, which is the biggest part of our economics, is breaking all records, and we're less exposed to advertising revenue than most other media organizations. But 2 days ago, we announced some redundancies in the company. Some people are going to lose their jobs at a very difficult time to lose your jobs, and trying and get your arms around that and try and provide a compelling narrative and explanation of what's happening, but in a way which is not impervious to criticism and allows people to ask you questions. So I would say listening but leading is the kind of challenge of where we are now.
Perfect.
I think Shahrzad, you're on mute. I
can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Mark, appreciate obviously your response, and I think it's a really good point that you bring up about listening and trying to obviously during these difficult times hear what others have to say, as well as obviously acting on things that we believe in as leaders. And Mathias, it'd be great to also if you can actually share your thoughts on leadership and accountability.
Yeah, with pleasure, Shahrzad. I mean, the Corona crisis is clearly the crisis with the biggest impact on the economy and on our societies, also politically. So if a crisis in general is in a way amplifying and accelerating certain developments, then this crisis is also in that context a tremendous opportunity. And I think we all feel it. It is so much easier during a crisis to innovate, to try out new things, to go different ways. Also collaboration among employees of different divisions is a lot more intense and a lot more informal. So incredible opportunities for leaders to drive change. At the same time, if so much is changing and the emotion of the moment is so strong, it is very seductive for a leader to think that you have to react too fast to certain things, and that there is also seduction to give up certain principles. And I think this is at the same time super dangerous, because the bigger a crisis is, the more change there is going on. I think the more you have to reflect what are really the principles and the values that your whole kind of operation, your professional life, your existence is based on. And in that context, I concretely think that we should be very careful in changing things for a good cause too fast without really thinking it through and without really knowing the consequences. And I think that's why principledness of a leader, value-based leadership, is particularly important. And more concretely, I think the biggest threat of that crisis is that the economic consequences and the social consequences of that could really limit the freedom and individual rights of open societies, could really strengthen authoritarian systems. There is a very concrete likelihood that China is going to be the big winner of the crisis, because authoritarian systems are in a way short-term always better, because they're simply stricter with regard to crisis management. So if they are basically managing the crisis in a very authoritarian way very well, they could be the first going back to normal. They could be the ones buying up depreciated assets all around the world, and with that create a lot of power and impact that is influencing free and open democracies. So I think every leader, and particularly as a leader of a journalistic organization, of a public publishing organization, I think the defense of the values of freedom, open societies, human rights, and the kind of rule of law in the sense that we have defined it in our constitutions, that I think is the most important thing for leaders. And every leader has in that context a very, very special responsibility these days.
Thank you, Mathias. And how do you think that we should, we can make return to normal after COVID, return to better?
Well, return to normal definitely should not mean return to old normal. It needs to be a new normal. And the new normal, I think, is definitely going to be different with regard to our working habits. I mean, that is totally obvious. We all shifted our company, our employees in a very short period of time to home office. We may have all had these concerns. What are people doing if they are just sitting at home? We find out that efficiency, that productivity is even higher. For me, I have to say it's a personal kind of very fulfilling experience, because it is almost 15 years ago that I have said publicly, and since then repeated it constantly, we do measure our employees by performance, not by presence. You can work wherever you are, whenever you want, as long as you are creating value and as long as you are really performing well. And it has never really been taken totally seriously, I have to say, in our own organizations. A lot of opposition against it from various hierarchy levels, losing control and so on. That was always seen as a threat. And now people suddenly find out it's working pretty well. And why would we be so stupid to just go back to the old normal? So I think we will have totally new forms of meeting culture, of traveling culture, of conferencing culture. and with that, we can have a more modern, a more human, and at the same time, a more productive workflow. And I hope that in general, as I said, companies, and particularly the publishing industry, is going to be more innovative post-corona, and that journalism is going to be more relevant and more appreciated post-corona. I think you could say that the corona crisis had, particularly for journalism, created a golden moment where journalism was more needed, more credible news, reliable sources have been more appreciated than probably ever before. So I think if we do it right, we can definitely benefit from that.
Thank you. We all know that when you're looking at, we live in obviously an era where news organizations like Fox and CNN have become more so entertainment as companies and seeking ratings and audiences at any cost or consequence. And leaders of obviously such businesses have fiduciary duties to their shareholders, and they do everything they can to maximize shareholder value, even when their actions could cause public confusion or harm. And my question for you is, should news organizations have accountability to the public beyond their fiduciary duties to shareholders? And is there a role here for regulators? And Mark, it'd be great to, maybe we can start with you as someone that is running one of the largest publishing companies in the world, and of course in the US.
Sure, thank you, Shahrzad. And I want to say, and I think Mathias and I think you'll find us strongly agreeing about this point. Serious news organizations, organizations which are focused on trying to help the public understand the world, trying to provide the information, the context for people to try and figure out what's happening in our crazy world. It matters that they focus on their values and the consistency and excellence and objectivity, the independence with which they do that, more than ever. And I've got no doubt that both Axel Springer and the Times will go on doing that. I want to say, though, that we should be realistic, that news, there's been a spectrum of news probably since the first days of the first newspapers in the 17th century, of which has verged into gossip and rumor and celebrity chat and entertainment. And that's not a new thing. That's human beings love light-hearted, irreverent, playful content here as well. And some news organizations, because of that, when times are harder, when they're trying to build an audience, will focus on that entirely. And I do think we're going to see probably more than a separation than we've seen before between, as it were, the serious news providers and those who are really in a branch of the entertainment business. And I think that that's one of the ways in which I think the crisis, I mean, many people have said this, maybe it's even now a cliche, but I think it's worth saying, it's one of the ways in which the crisis is bringing the future to us more quickly. It's like trends we could see before the crisis are accelerating. Geopolitical trends, China, Mathias mentions that's a really good example of that, but also trends in our business. And I think one of the real paradoxes is, exactly as Mathias said, I think availability of credible, serious, truthful news about what's happening is more important now than ever. It's going to go on being really important. The economics of journalism, however, are in real trouble, and I suspect COVID is going to make that worse for many media organizations. Now, some are very successful. At the Times, we've got a very successful digital subscription model. It's the biggest part of our revenue. It's growing rapidly. Net, it's even possible that COVID will be actually an accelerant of the successful pivot of our news organization into a very profitable digital future. But many news organizations, and not just legacy newspapers, but many broadcast news providers, are heavily reliant on advertising. And I suspect one of the things we're going to see because of this is a further big shift of advertising dollars into pure play digital. And anyway, that's a world where the very big digital platforms have colossal power and where they compete very effectively against publishers. So I think trying to figure out ways in which that can be underpinned, the economics of journalism can be underpinned without damaging the independence of publishers is a really key thread. And I want to say about regulators, I'm very much in two minds about whether you want regulatory involvement to police the quality of news. There's a real instinct amongst many governments, authoritarian governments, but not just authoritarian governments, to get more involved in controlling what people read and see and watch and listen to. And the danger with regulators is they report to politicians, and politicians often have their own agenda. So I would say, in the end, with all its faults and failings, I believe in a pretty open market of ideas and perspectives, and an element of trusting the public to distinguish between what they can believe, what they can trust, and then what they don't. In areas like child protection, potentially also in extremism and fighting terrorism, there may be a case for regulatory involvement, but the more we can keep the politicians and the regulators out of deciding what the public can see, the better, I think.
So do you believe in self-regulation? Because we've seen this with Twitter, and Twitter finally has come out and they are identifying between tweets that are factual, that are not factual. And going back to your previous point, how do we make sure that the good players succeed? Because if this is a competition for ratings, you may end up, players that are creating news that are not necessarily factual succeeding.
So I think you raise a very, very interesting point. I think there's a difference which many people, including, it must be said, the President of the United States, willfully refuse to accept. There's a difference between censorship or a denial of freedom of expression and clearly labeling things and giving the public a good sense of the context, the placing of the thing. And I think it's completely reasonable for a digital platform to, help its users understand what it is they're looking at, whether it's being verified and whether it's not being verified. I think that's entirely reasonable. One of the big problems with the big digital platforms, be it Google, be it Facebook, be it Twitter, is that all of the signals that a user gets, for example, from a physical newspaper, even from a full, publisher website, about what's news, what's opinion, what is the stated view of the publication, what is a point of view that's been requested from maybe one politician. All of that can get lost in these digital environments, and the thing, without a context, can be misunderstood. And it's very easy for other people to write fake news and distorted stories and present them as if they're also true. So I think the more context, the better, actually. And I certainly think that it's much better. I'm not saying the digital platforms are there. I'm glad they are really beginning to finally focus on these issues. It's much better that companies do it themselves than there's an attempt to get politicians to try and figure a way through this, because I just fear they will. I mean, the President of the United States has made it very clear he would like to make it compulsory that for every liberal news story or liberal comment, there's a conservative one as well. I mean, that's a really good example, I think, of the temptation of politicians to try and jump into this space to begin to shape and control what the public see.
But don't you think that, Mark, we do need to see the same level of self-regulation that digital platforms are starting to look at also with some of the traditional players? I mean, is there hope that Fox will self-regulate?
Well, I think I want to say, I think that publishers should be free to pursue, their perspective. Many publications in the world have got an ideological perspective. Some of them are moderate, some of them are not moderate, some of them are left-wing, some of them are right-wing. Some news organizations, the New York Times is absolutely one of them, we strive in our news pages to be objective and not to favor one ideology over another. But I think the idea that there's a very broad marketplace of publishers with different perspectives, although it's very noisy and is untidy, I think is a good thing. I'm one of those people who believe that people should be allowed, for example, to say things which aren't true, or to do satirical takes on the news which are based on fantasy as well as the facts. That's always been the case in human societies, and I think it's part of what a free country and a free culture is like. So I wouldn't want to see, somebody storming into Fox News and arresting them because they've got a series of kind of, fairly out there conservative commentators. Let the public decide who to believe. And so I don't really believe in kind of social control or trying to socially engineer an, in quotes, better, more responsible debate. I think we have to accept that in a free society, the exchange of ideas and the exchange of news is going to be a bit of a free-for-all.
Great, thank you for that, Mark. Mathias, it'd be great to also get your thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, I think the COVID crisis and Black Lives Matter has not only accelerated the structural transformation of media from analog to digital, but at the same time also brought up one of the most interesting and fundamental debates of our industry. And that is something that you have already touched upon. I'd like to give you my view. Before I do that, I want to say that I immediately accepted to participate in this conference because Mark Thompson is one of the, if not the most admired media leaders in the world for me. And I'm so much, in a way, impressed by the incredible success that you have created with the digital transformation of the New York Times from 500,000 to 5 million, that there's almost no area where I would contradict. But I think we are approaching a topic where we might have a controversial debate, or at least where I have some questions to you. And that is really totally related to the topic that we are discussing. The big debate that we have at the moment is journalism still supposed to be as objective, as neutral as possible? Or is that over? And it seems that particularly among the millennials, there is a growing consensus that journalism should stand up for a good cause. We have that debate within the Business Insider newsroom in New York. We have it in the Politico newsroom in Brussels. We have it in our newsrooms here in Berlin and elsewhere in the world. And I think that is really interesting because you could say, let the public decide, as you have said, Mark. But you could also say, if the public decides, then it is probably the non-neutral, the non-objective model that is more successful. Then that is more the activist model that generates more clicks, that generates more subscription, that is business-wise simply more successful because people like to get kind of confirmed in their own worldview and sometimes in their own prejudice. And that these kind of nasty critical questions show the other side of the coin, strive for neutrality. That is not so popular. At the same time, I think it is a very dangerous path if we go in that direction. We also had these articles in Germany where people say end of neutrality. Neutrality is old school. Yeah? Young people want to have a clear point of view, a fight for a good cause. But let's take the example of the New York Times, and I really would be interested in, Mark, in your view, with this incredible digital subscription number, with this huge fan club that is also part of the New York Times because you are the most convincing organization against the present government for very good reasons. After this article has been published of Bennett, he had to leave the New York Times because otherwise simply too many of your digital subscribers would have unsubscribed. So you could say the more biased, the more one-sided, the more activist-like journalism is perceived. Whether it's right or wrong is a different question. But the more it is perceived as that, the higher the risk is that it is not only leaving the principles of audiatur et altera pars, listen to the other side, try to show all points of views and let the reader decide. And at the same time, it also increases the economic dependency on this kind of activist consensus There is this term of weaponized consensus. I think we journalists, publishers should fight against all forms of weaponized consensus. It's always dangerous, and you could say that's anti-journalism. So with that little kind of question or provocation, Mark, I would really be curious how you see the things.
Very, very, very good, Mathias. And I should just begin by just returning the compliment. When I got in the early 2000s, I was, in my view, unexpectedly put in charge of quite large organizations wrestling with the digital challenge. I kind of, one of the questions I asked people, who's doing this well? And people said, well, there's this German guy, he's very, very tall. And he's changing his organization, he's digging deep, he's changing the culture, he's fundamentally pivoting his organization in a way that nobody else in Europe or the world is. So I've always thought of Mathias as one of the absolute pathfinders of all of this. So thank you for that. Now, having said that, Mathias has just asked a really complicated and intriguing question. Let me try and do it some kind of justice in a fairly short period of time. It's a big, complicated question. So what I want to say is, and I'll come on to the particular case of the article by Senator Tom Cotton, which led to a big row in the inside and outside of the Times a few weeks ago. I absolutely believe that the New York Times, just like, by the way, the BBC, which I used to run, should represent a broad range of opinion. It should represent from the extreme left, as it were, through to the extreme right. There are limits, but basically a very broad range of views. And I also believe, I'm not directly responsible for the journalism or the opinion department, I believe that we're going to go on doing that. We should do that, and we should absolutely continue to run pieces which offend many of our readers. And we should never worry about subscription cancellations or that kind of protest if we think the pieces are well, as it were, properly expressed and meet our editorial standards. With the case in point of this, in particular, this opinion piece written by Senator Cotton it had not really been put through its paces. The character of opinion in the New York Times, of opinion pieces in the New York Times, is they're meant to be thoughtful, they're meant to be intelligent, they're meant to be civil. They're not meant to be full of very provocative political rhetoric. That's not the point of it. This is meant to be a staging of a thoughtful discussion. And that piece had not been properly put through its editorial paces, and indeed had not even been read by the head of the opinion department, which is why, in the end, the head of the opinion department resigned. But I'm very, very behind and a passionate believer in the full range of opinions. And if you say to me that, do we face the same challenge inside the Times that Mathias is facing in his New York office, I'm not surprised to hear that, with some of our employees, not by any means exclusively, but maybe weighted towards millennials and Gen Zs, who have a very different view about the future of journalism than the traditions of the New York Times, versus maybe some, again, weighted towards, not exclusively, older, more established employees who have more traditional perspectives. We are. That debate is ongoing. I'm very clear, though, that where the Times stands and should stand, even if it's unpopular internally, even if it's unpopular with the majority of our subscribers, is to stand for being an open platform in our opinion pages and being independent, objective, and impartial in our news pages. And I believe that's achievable. Moreover, I think if you're an activist, if you want the world to change and be a better place, you actually need the public to see and hear impartial, accurate news, and you need to see and hear the full range of opinions. In other words, my view is objective journalism and a broad range of opinions in your opinion pages actually helps make the world a better place. And that's the case I think we have to win with our audiences.
And if I may interject, Mark, you make a really good point, but I think one of the challenges that we are facing is that not all news organizations are discerning between fact and opinion.
Sure.
And when it comes to facts, should we not have news organizations be compelled to tell the truth or tell you when they know something is actually not true?
Well, I mean, to be quite clear, I think that I believe news organizations should do that. I believe they should do that. But I'm also a very strong believer, and maybe I'm a Brit, but maybe I'm becoming American. I'm a very strong believer in very extensive freedom of expression. And I think compelling speech, compelling someone to say something they don't want to say is problematic in itself. And can I just say one thing, which is I think the risk, one of the risks of this debate goes like this. What's your opinion of the public? If you are pessimistic, if you think the public are sheep, they can't decide for themselves, they don't have critical faculties, they will slavishly read whatever they see or read, then you believe in control. You have to, the ordinary people just can't decide. They will be led, by the latest person with a lie. Now, that's not my view of the public. I think that's a patronizing view of the public. I think human beings are born with critical faculties. I think there's immense common sense out there. I think the truth wins in the end, because I think people are smart enough over time, not always immediately, but over time, to actually recognize it and distinguish for themselves between what's true and what's false. And one of the disheartening things, an awful lot of people I really like and respect, I think don't trust the public. And I always want to say, well, what about you? I mean, do you think you've got the critical faculties? And they'll say, well, I do, but I just don't think other people have. And I think that's actually a slightly elitist, patronizing view of the world, that we, the elite, must come up with regulations and controls and laws to stop the common people from making up their own minds. I think the public have got a right to make up their own minds, and they've got a right to see a broad range of opinions.
I subscribe every word. I could not agree more. And I really, really detest this patronizing worldview. I couldn't agree more. But I think that's why the real problem is not the distinction of news, facts, and opinion. On the other hand, it is very much about diversity of opinions, and of course, responsibility and truthfulness of facts. But what really worries me, and what is a new phenomenon, is that we have this kind of subjective facts or different definitions of facts, and each crowd, each team has its own facts, and that the trust in facts and the trust also in the sources for facts is decreasing big time, and in a very, very scary speed. And here I think we have to discuss the role of social media and the role of the tech platforms. You addressed that topic. Basically, Twitter, Facebook, Google transformed step by step into news and entertainment platforms, into media companies, into publishing companies. And the size of these companies, the number of customers, the market share, Google in Germany, mobile search, 98%, Facebook, 3 billion customers globally. This creates such a new power and such an incredible impact. And then this very complicated question, do they take responsibility for the truthfulness, or do they reject that? There are good reasons to reject it, because you could say, if Facebook decides what is true and what is untrue, what is good or what is bad, it's a global monopoly of news distribution and information, and has a power that no cartel office in the world and no politician and no individual should ever accept. Now, if they then, on the other hand, say, we remain neutral, we are just a technology platform, it's also not true, because people can use these platforms and can have a big, big impact and can influence political decisions. And we have seen where that can lead to, from Brexit based on false information and untrue facts, to other big democracies in the world. So that is really something that is changing the whole industry big time. And I think we strongly have to define the role of the platforms. And my personal recommendation would be, the more platforms are reduced, and if it is needed by the regulator, reduced to a technological tool that distributes content and information, and the more responsibility is left on the side of the content creators and on the side of the publishers and journalistic organizations, the healthier the system will be, but that only based on one very important precondition, that is that there is a healthy ecosystem in which publishers have a real, a decent, a sustainable business model. And based on that business model, there is enough incentive for enough publishers to come up with new ideas and do new things. And only that creates the diversity and the competition of offerings that really informs the world well, and then also takes the responsibility that you, Shahrzad, have addressed. I think the role of the platforms cannot be underestimated in that context. And there are some developments in the recent past that I think are going into the wrong direction. But in the long run, I remain optimistic, because I think no regulator, no politician can ever accept in the long run that this system is getting totally out of control, and that in the end, 2 or 3 platforms decide who is getting which information and what is true and what is untrue.
Right. And Mathias, to that point, you know, speaking of the role of the platforms, do you see them as collaborators or competitors? And how are these relationships evolving? And, you know, where do you fit into, you know, where does that fit into your overall long-term vision? Do you see brighter days ahead in how your respective organizations coexist and collaborate, or how do you see that changing and evolving?
The answer is short and very complicated. The platforms are frenemies. So they are our friends, our partners, our business partners. We do a lot of business with them. On very, very different levels with all the platforms. We have intense business relations. We spend a lot of money for advertising on these platforms. We get traffic from them. And there is a lot of business going on various levels. That's why they are partners and why they need to be partners. On the other hand, if we look to the bigger picture, and if we look to the ecosystem, and if we look to the regulatory framework and to the fairness of competition, and if we look to copyrights, to intellectual property rights, and how they can use or abuse the existing framework in order to come up with a smarter business model, which is 0 content creation costs, full access to the greatest content of the world, and almost 100% of the monetization of that content through advertising, and controlling the customer and having all the data, and with that totally dominating advertising and potential subscription business relationships. That leads us then more into the camp of they are enemies. And we have very different interests, and we have very different views. And we need to find a good balance. I think it's always this kind of, these guys are against Google or against Facebook or against Twitter or against Amazon. This is nonsense. We are not, we cannot. They are some of the greatest, most impressive companies of modern history. They have a very positive impact on the world. But if we continue in certain areas that they can basically abuse their market dominating positions, that they can abuse their absolute unbeatable competitive advantage with regard to data knowledge and using the data treasury. And if we do not find a kind of smarter, more modern way of regulation or ecosystem, then I think it's going to be dangerous. Then I think a split up, a breakup of these platforms is sooner or later the only alternative. I personally don't think so, and that very concretely to your questions, to your question today, I'm a lot more optimistic that we are getting to that healthier ecosystem with more balance, more level playing field, more fairness, and a predictable framework, also legal framework for content creators to have decent and healthy businesses. The likelihood today is a lot higher than 3 years ago, and simply because the customer realize that it is in their interest to have diversity and not be kind of dependent on one platform. And also the society, politics are realizing the limits. And I think that healthy pressure is creating a positive momentum. And I would take a bet, in 5 years, we will have a much better situation today, a lot more balanced, more diversity, and a lot fairer than it is today.
Thank you for that, Mathias. And Mark, maybe we can go back to you, also get your thoughts in terms of your relationship with the platforms. And also maybe you can speak to your also growth strategy and specifically as it relates to news organizations. Of course, they've generally used a couple of key levers, as you mentioned earlier, from advertising to subscription to obviously power your core business model. And I know that, you know, with COVID, there tends to be a lot of focus on the doom and gloom. And of course, you know, as we talked about with respect to also the encroachment by these tech platforms, would love to know, what are you excited about as it relates to the growth opportunities for your business, for the publishing business, both in the medium and long term?
Sure, and I want to say that I mean, firstly, the frenemy, the point that these very big platforms are both competitors, straightforwardly, sometimes competitors. They are, sometimes they feel like they're between us and our users. They're so much bigger than all of us. Even the biggest media companies in the world are minnows compared to these organizations, that the relationships can feel scary. It just feels scary. And I think that idea, because they are predominantly platforms, that we're still some way off what you might describe as fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory access to the platforms and behavior from the platforms is absolutely true. We still find ourselves, or discover that we've signed terms and conditions, sometimes many years ago, which are essentially entirely one-sided, which have been just proposed by the platforms, and which publishers around the world meekly signed, and which are not in our advantage. So there's something about trying to get that playing field much fairer, and that is somewhere where I think regulation and antitrust and other kinds of oversight are appropriate. Generally, my sense is the platforms are beginning to recognise that this can't continue quite as it is, and I would say generally our relationship with the platforms has been improving in most cases, and I would say particularly about Google and more recently Facebook, that we've seen some progress from our point of view. I think we also need to recognise they play a big part in our success. I mean, the New York Times used to be a physical newspaper that you could get in Manhattan, you could get just about in the outer boroughs, maybe a little bit of Long Island, a bit of New Jersey, but it was a regional American newspaper, big reputation, global reputation, but a local newspaper. In March this year, we had 240 million users around the world, and you know, Google in particular, but you know, all of these platforms have played a part in that, and so some of the value exchange has been the other way as well. One of the things that's really important is the platforms and their willingness to help us with our objectives. And our principal objective is around driving our subscription model. And that's really about saying, what we're really trying to do is trying to develop very deep, lasting relationships with users. And that process of guiding a user so they find you for the first time, you get much more expert about how you engage them, how you bring them back. You use lots of different tools to try and make the Times, in our case, useful to them. Could be a different medium. Our podcast, The Daily, is really important in bringing people back day after day. It could be in the middle of all the doom and gloom. It could be a recipe, our cooking product, and our ability to drop colourful, attractive recipes for pizzas and God knows what onto our home screen alongside all this terrible news. It could be that. So trying to find those, and then trying to be much more expert and deliberate about the user journey and customer journey, which draws someone in to sample the Times, gets them into an introductory relationship, and then gets them to a higher price relationship. At every point in this, the platforms can help us. Being able to sign up via the platform, if you get the data, if the relationship is right, is very useful. If somebody using Google can use their Google identity also to become a registered, logged on user of the Times, that's really important. The same with Apple, the same with Facebook, and so on. So there are lots of ways in which these platforms, I think, can guide people to high quality content. We're seeing that with Netflix, we're seeing it with Spotify, We're seeing it with with many of the world's publications. And I think, I mean, like Mathias, I mean, I do think the idea of a more collaborative relationship with the big platforms coming out of COVID is something we shouldn't lose sight of. We've been through, and no doubt have still some more battles to have with the platforms, but they can help us. And I think given the reputational problems they've got at the moment, we can really help them as well.
For sure, no, that was great. I know that we don't have much time left, and I do want to use the 7 minutes left so we can address some of the questions from the audience. But before we do that, I do want to kind of really highlight some of what was discussed. Of course, you know, in terms of what the comments that were made, they're very much so uplifting for myself, including in terms of the reminder that, of course, great leadership is at the heart of positive change in the world. You know, whether if you're looking at accountability to quality and justice, to really ensuring a truthful representation in media. And I personally believe that the solution to the world's problems is still lie in great leadership. So I really thank both of you for the work that you're doing on all fronts, obviously to build bridges in terms of, you know, whether if you're looking at with your partners, the audience, the public, advancing, of course, the global discussion and to foster a really healthy news and journalism industry. Why don't we go to the audience and let's take the first question. I'm just going to go to the chat. I believe we had 16 questions submitted. And I would love to ask the great team at Founders to unmute Alex Webb, please.
Oh, hi, everyone. It's Alex Wood here. I'm the European editor at Forbes. Thank you all for such a great discussion. My question is for Mark. I really enjoyed what you were saying about the importance of freedom of speech, allowing people to make up their own minds as readers. But something that I'm really finding challenging myself as an editor right now is the idea that the end user, the reader, really understands that fine line between what is a factual news piece and what is an opinion piece. And I just wanted to ask you what your view is in terms of how we call that out. Do we need to make it visually different, or do we need to educate our readers better?
I think the more clues we can give people, the better. I feel that very strongly. I think we've lost the geography of a physical paper largely, where you've got opinion pages over here, you've got the front page over here, and all the rest of it. And I think the more clues we can give people, and the more we can make sure that those clues and those signals are attached to the pieces as they go out on their own, you know, into the ecosystem. But I have to say, I do think it's a real issue. And, you know, I just feel that almost at the level of teaching civics in schools, that making sure that young people understand that there's two good things. One good thing is access to high quality information about the world. Another good thing is taking part in a lively debate about what should happen in the world. They're both valuable, they're different. And I absolutely agree with you. It worries me as well. I think many users are struggling to understand that difference because they've not really learned it. And I think particularly when it's individual pieces in, like, say, social media, it is incredibly easy for people to get confused, especially if, frankly, people are trying to help them get confused. So in other words, when a news story is then retweeted, let's say, in a way which puts a spin on it, right there, you've got a signal, which is a genuine signal, but it's actually a false signal. So I think it's an immensely difficult problem.
Thank you. For the next question, we can go to Gregory Selinger. If you can have the Founders team unmuting him, that'd be great.
Hello, Mark. I had a question. It was related to the digital transformation of the New York Times has been quite impressive, and in a sense a poster child. And I was wondering what have been really the key ingredients of the successful digital transformation of the New York Times, and especially on the subscription front.
Okay, so I'll do this, but I'm sure Mathias should answer this as well, because I think Mathias is
and Mathias also, I'm sure.
Yeah. But so I'll point to, there's a long, complicated story. I will tell you, point to two things. In 2015, we came up with a very simple one-page strategic statement which was about, this is going to be a relationship-based, subscription-first, smartphone-first business. A smartphone matters more than anything. We are going to get expert at engaging people. We're going to bring them back much more often, and we're going to double our digital revenue. So we had a kind of clarion call about, this is our business. This is how it's got to change. The other thing, which took us a really long time, and we screwed it up half a dozen times before we got this right, was completely changing the way we organized the company in terms of its digital operations. And instead of leading it by vertical departments and trying to get these different departments to work together, which they just found very difficult, we've got teams, often quite junior teams, drawn from across all of the skills, and which have got leaders who are empowered and have their hands on the digital roadmaps, the product and engineering roadmaps. So you've got often people in their late 20s, early 30s. I mean, they can be different ages, but often they're relatively junior leaders who have got their own test and learn platform. They've got their own objectives, and they just go ahead and do it. And we've let go and just let them get on with it. And that's really accelerated the story for us.
Well, from my side, when we started, Axel Springer was 100% analog company. Today, 3/4 of the revenues and 86% of the profits are coming from digital businesses. How did we get there? I think three important convictions. One, no fear of self-cannibalization. We have aggressively and radically cannibalized our existing analog business to the well-being of the company. But of course, that was very difficult at the beginning. And the second underlying assumptions were that we said no silos. So we, from the very beginning, said we have to have kind of multimedia responsibilities that everybody can be a winner of the digital transformation. And no separation between analog and digital, guys. That was a quite contrarian view that we took. And the third was at the beginning, where we did a lot of M&A activities, no integration by headquarter culture, a lot of freedom and individual entrepreneurial room to maneuver. I think that the kind of two very hard kind of external framework preconditions for successful digital transformation are the belief that journalism is something that people also in the digital future have to pay for. That was, when I expressed that the first time 15 years ago, an indication that this guy has no clue about the internet, because on the internet everything is available for free. And the second assumption is that we need a legal framework where intellectual property is legally protected, in the sense that if somebody wants to use it for commercial purposes, she or he has to pay for that. And that is a precondition also for the successful monetization. So in the end, it is more and more shifting from advertising monetization to subscription monetization. That is, I think, strengthening the independence of journalism. And that's why I'm so super optimistic that digital journalism, also quality-wise, going to be much, much better, more profound, more in-depth, more creative, also aesthetically a lot more compelling. And that we are still at a very, very early stage of the creative and quality opportunities of digital journalism. But if these preconditions, clearly protected intellectual property right, and the willingness of the consumer to pay because we have the right products for them, then I'm super optimistic for digital journalism.
Wonderful. I think our time has come to an end. I don't know if we want to do one more final question. Just wanted to be careful of the time with Mathias and Mark. Would you be able to do one more question before we finish?
Depends on our answers. If we are short, we can do it.
Wonderful. Well, why don't we go to Massimo Redaielli? Sorry if I don't say the name correctly. Can we have the Founders Forum team unmute me? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Not to worry. The question is for Mathias, and is related to copyrights. When we met at the Google Camp, I think was 2014, it was at the peak of your criticism to the Silicon Valley model for not wanting to pay for content. Now, Mark mentioned the difficulties that the publishing industry has in competing with those platforms. You mentioned before that the collaboration model is probably going to be unveiling more friendly. What do you consider being a healthier system between the fact that so far the competition is very unfair?
Well, very shortly from my side, and then I would be curious also to hear Mark's views from a US perspective, because in Europe we are really making a lot of progress here. I think healthier would be if platforms are obliged to pay through license or through a kind of output deal like agreement for the content that they use to their benefit for advertising monetization. And that is related to intellectual property right protection. We have fought for that in Germany for years and got a law that has been outmaneuvered by Google because they simply said every publisher who wants to take advantage of that law is going to be delisted by Google. So only the headlines remain, no photo, no video, no text. That's basically the message, you're out of business. Now, we came to the conclusion a national solution doesn't help. We need a European solution, 500 million Europeans. That's even a serious signal for a player like Google or Facebook and others. So we got last year the approval for the European copyright reform that is also obliging the platforms to pay for publishers' content if they use it. That is going to implement it on a national level in the next month. And I think that would be then and will be and is the breakthrough. And I would be curious to hear from Mark, because we hear from American publishers organizations that they think there is an opportunity to achieve something similar in Washington in America. I would be curious to hear your view here.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do that and to try and also answer Massimo's question. Look, I think, you know, in a perfect world, what we would most want is help from people to build our own business and to drive our subscriber growth and to leave us with a direct relationship with the customer. We don't want people really to consume too much of our journalism outside our own environment. We want people to come to our environment and for us to be able to present our journalism in that place. So apart from else, we can do things like make sure they understand the difference between news and opinion. So actually, I don't want too much consumption of our journalism off our own platforms. But I agree with absolutely, Mathias. Insofar as people are exploiting, and we allow them to exploit our journalism on other platforms, we should get something in return. That could be help with the subscription business. If it's not going to be that, it's going to be money. And I would say we're beginning. I think we're not as far down this road as our European friends are towards seeing the platforms wanting to pay. Facebook News, their new news tab, they're paying us a substantial amount of money over a number of years to have a level of availability of the New York Times in that environment. Google has not yet done that beyond what they've announced in Europe today, but we expect something like that for elsewhere, and we'll have to decide whether to take part in that or not. Stepping back though, although I do think we're going to see more of this, and I think it's part of the overall political and regulatory pressure on the big platforms, I also think we need to be quite careful. I worry about, let's take a European country, a large part of the journalism being dependent on handouts from a digital platform, or you know, a system of subsidy, of a kind of transfer of money from platforms, which is in the hands of a government. The ideal, if we can do it, is to have independent institutions. They can be private companies, or they can be public bodies, they can be like public broadcasters, who've got some level of guaranteed funding, but also some level of a guarantee of independence from government and from powerful global companies. And so I think there's something about how do we get governance around this right in a way which really preserves the independence of the publisher, and also doesn't run the risk that the future of the availability of journalism in your country partly depends on the financial health of a couple of companies in Silicon Valley. So I think there's a lot. I mean, I think we're in the early stages of trying to work how to turn these, I think, interesting developments into a really sustainable new business model for journalism.
One last sentence from my side. Journalism needs to remain a business in order to attract diverse players. And we don't want to receive subsidies or bribes, neither from the state nor from platforms. We want to have a decent model in order to make an attractive business.
I agree with that.
Wonderful. And that's a great way to obviously end this wonderful panel. I wanted to thank everyone for your time. I wanted to thank the two amazing leaders that joined us, Mark and Mathias. Really appreciate your time, and thanks to our great audience for really obviously being engaged and asking great questions. And it was truly an honor to be part of the conversation. Thank you, everybody.